Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Lettis, and I'm with ICF and part of the consultant team leading this research effort, along with High Street Consulting and Applied Pavement Technology on effective methods for setting transportation performance targets. I'm joined today by Brad Allen from Applied Pavement Technology, who will also be facilitating, and panelists Jacob Booth from Connecticut DOT and Justin Bruner from Pennsylvania DOT. Today's workshop is the fourth in a series of 6 web-based workshops, the purpose of which are to raise awareness of the results of the research effort, which is the Guidebook on Effective Methods for Setting Transportation Performance Targets, provide useful information to help transportation practitioners understand effective methods for setting transportation performance targets, how to implement these methods, and what issues to consider in selecting a method, drawing on the research conducted through this study, and help transportation practitioners to further their engagement in dialogue on target setting methods to learn from the results of this study and from each other. The focus of this workshop is target setting methods for bridge condition measures. Before we get started, I'd like to note that this workshop will be recorded and make sure that everyone is able to navigate the Zoom platform. So after each of our speakers and at the end of the workshop, there will be time for questions. As questions come up throughout the workshop, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. And when you raise your hand, one of the facilitators will give you the ability to unmute. I'll turn it over to Brad now.
Thanks, Sarah. As we get started, you can see some helpful tips to help you navigate Zoom. And I believe there's a note we can drop in the chat if anybody needs access to closed captioning. We'll get that into the chat. So as Sarah mentioned today, we're speaking about part of the manual that's in the pre-publication process with Transportation Research Board to help states and other transportation agencies identify effective methods for setting targets. And today we are specifically going to be speaking about bridges and have a couple great presentations lined up for you from 2 state DOTs. But before we get into that, I'll give a little bit of a brief overview of the guide itself in its current form. So the guide is presented in 3 parts. The first part of the guide presents an overview of target setting approaches, things you should know, foundations for target setting, and some general tips for how to go about target setting, identify the approach you want to take, and some information that you need to get yourself going. The guide then looks at specific approaches that can be applied to different types of performance management. So within part 2 of the guide, we specifically look at target setting approaches for safety, infrastructure condition, reliability, and traffic congestion. And within the infrastructure condition, we separately look at bridges and pavements. And for those of you familiar with the federal transportation performance management requirements, you're probably catching on that the format of this guide very much follows those requirements that state DOTs and metropolitan planning organizations need to follow. But the advice in the guide is also applicable to other performance areas, other performance measures or targets that agencies may want to set targets for. And the advice in the guide can then be applied to other areas, but the specifics through the guide and the examples, are based on meeting the TPM target setting requirements. So, the guidebook identifies methods for each national performance area and identifies ways that targets can be set. And you can see some of these general approaches for setting targets are more data-driven than others. So the policy-based approach is the most technically simplistic, and you can see an example of there possibly be just setting a target of no more than 5% of your pavements in poor condition. You can also look at historic data and look to establish the trend of historic conditions and extrapolate that trend out into the future and use that to inform target setting. You can also look at probabilistic approaches to account for variability in performance. These can be developed using confidence intervals with upper and lower bounds of the target ranges that can be considered during developing the targets. So we don't see too much of that in the infrastructure target setting yet, but it might be something interesting to talk about at the end of today's presentations. Statistical models that can account for explanatory factors. So in the safety and congestion areas, you'll see a lot of regression models. We may use some of that, particularly when looking to modify historic trends. I'll be talking about that in a minute for bridge conditions, specifically, pavement conditions also, other asset conditions. But what we use for modeling in the infrastructure area most often are asset management applications, modeling tools. So a lot of what we present falls under other tools and models because there are already very robust software packages that we use to model the performance of different assets and then use those to evaluate and predict future performance under different scenarios. So with this also, we have to look at, so those were some approaches, kind of the technical basis of your approach, but we also need to look at your overall target setting philosophy. And this can vary between agencies. It can vary between performance areas within an agency. An agency may be willing to set an aspirational target for one performance area, but want to remain conservative in another. So a conservative target helps you make sure that you are achieving the target or making progress towards that target, which is a key, that last one is a key term for TPM requirements. And between these two, the realistic or predictive target setting approach is where you're laying out. This is more in line with the SMART target setting approach of establishing specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound targets. So it's setting out a target where you think your achievement will actually be at a specific time in the future. Excuse me. So any of these philosophies can be used to set effective target. It really depends on the objectives of your organization in that specific performance area. And we spent a lot of time on the research team and with the project panel talking about that word effective and what makes a target effective. And I think we'll hear some of that today. And again, it really varies by agency. Some of the things that factor into an effective target that we speak about on the guide, or we write about in the guide, is ease of application. That really helps you put a practice in place that will be repeatable, and you can build some momentum and really move forward and build your maturity from a starting point and maybe move on to more technically robust approaches. So having a technically robust approach allows you to understand your data quality, your data needs, and lay out a framework where you can develop targets and you can point to an approach that is defensible and objective. You also want to make sure targets can be easily communicated. And that is a challenge in the area of infrastructure as we try to communicate the difference between a fair asset or a good asset and different measures that can factor into those types of ratings. So we want to make sure that your target can be communicated to stakeholders and other folks who are involved in the process, as well as your customers. You also want to make sure that you allow for policy considerations and understanding that there may be limits to the amount of improvement that you're able to implement over a given period of time. And a lot of that is because agencies are managing more than one performance area at a time. And we have to realize that this is, we're implementing performance management across the entire agency's mission, not specifically for infrastructure or just for bridges. All right. So with bridges, there are lots of state performance measures that they may look at. Most bridge performance measures are established based on the National Bridge Inventory data or the core elements data. So we generally have good quality common data across agencies related to bridges. There is, the federal measure of the percentage of bridges on the national highway system that are classified in poor condition. And we won't get into all the details of that requirement, but agencies may want to set targets for the percentage of bridges or the number of bridges or the amount of bridges by deck area, as it is in the case of this one, that are in good condition or fair condition or meet a more meet some numerical value of quality based on the bridge inspection data. And regardless of that, the approaches that we have in the guide can be applied to any of those types of targets. All right, so what specifically do we present in the guide for target setting methods for bridge conditions? So we have 5 methods that we present for infrastructure conditions, along with specific details related to application to bridge performance targets as well as pavements. Now, a little plug for next week's webinar, which will be on pavement target setting 1 week for today. So the way you see them arranged on the screen here is really from the more technically simplistic approach to a technically robust approach. And it's not to say that any one of these approaches is better or could be more effective for your agency. It's just a nice way to be able to organize them and describe them from a fairly simple approach to a more complicated approach. So targeted change is that policy-based approach that we talked about, where you simply look at your current conditions, maybe look at your historic conditions and establish this is where we want to be at a given point in the future. Or maybe in the case of the federal measure, which is on the percent poor, it might be a floor. You just say as an agency, we will do what we need to do to make sure we don't drop below a given condition. In that case, numerically above a percent poor bridges. So a time series trend takes it from that to look at how have our bridges been performing in the past? Can we establish a performance curve from that and extrapolate that curve out into the future? And just looking at using historic performance as a predictor for the future, and then using that prediction to inform our target setting process. And we may want to modify that. If we have changes in policies, if we have changes in investment approaches. So we've summarized that as trend plus future funding. And that could be a level of funding. It could also be a change in your use of the funding. And there are examples of states that when the original federal targets were being set back in 2018, were in the process of changing their bridge investment strategies from a prioritized based on bridges in the worst condition to an approach where they look to set aside a certain amount of funding for preservation of bridges that were in good or fair condition. And so that meant that looking at historic performance wouldn't necessarily predict the trend of the future. So they looked at ways to investigate that and modify that future curve based on changes in the funding. So the next step would be to use your bridge management system, in this case, to look at your expected level of funding, your expected investment strategy, use that in your bridge management system to forecast future conditions and use those conditions to inform your investment, your target setting, sorry. And then the next step from that would be not to just look at the scenario of this is how we expect to invest, but to look at alternate scenarios. Maybe there are risks to your funding. Maybe there's opportunities for increased funding in the future, or an opportunity to come up to implement a more effective strategy. Or possibly there's threats to funding and you want to see what might be the range of future condition levels depending on these different funding scenarios. Then this is an approach where you can look at these multiple scenarios through your management system and use all of those outputs to inform your target setting process. And we'll have presentations on each of these last two approaches today. So a few just highlights on each of these approaches and some examples of some of them. As I said, targeted change, this is the simplest approach. It allows agencies to set targets where there's little data or maybe limited confidence in your ability to establish prediction models. Unfortunately, though, with this, the limitations, it really doesn't provide any insights into causes of your forecasted outcomes. So the time series trend, it's a relatively simple approach. You don't need any special analysis tools. You can use spreadsheets. What you need is relatively quality historic data. What this approach does not allow you to do is to account for changes in your business practices, in your funding levels, things like that, that could impact future performance that maybe have occurred since the historic data was collected. So we can adjust for that, particularly funding for infrastructure is the main variable. So we can look to adjust for that and say, well, we're expecting, in this case, we've seen declining conditions. We can come up with a best fit curve for those historic conditions, but we're expecting an increase in funding, or maybe we're seeing an increase in funding and we expect that to continue. So as we model that trend into the future, we have an opportunity to temper that decline in this case and show that we expect to turn the tide on these conditions a few years in the future. So model-based is a typical output you would expect from a bridge management system. Our 3-color bar charts, asset managers, we love our 3-color bar charts. It's using, in this case, your bridge management system to take in data. Historic data is used to establish deterioration curves of bridges or elements of bridges. We define treatments and understand the impact of different treatments to bridge conditions, both immediately and in the future, how those deteriorate, establish costs for each treatment, and rules for when you would or would not apply the treatment. And then you can apply different funding scenarios to that and forecast your conditions and come up with very detailed output results. So it can provide quite a bit of data to inform your target setting process. Agencies, as they develop confidence in bridge management systems, tend to rely on these outputs and are very comfortable with the outputs. But it does require having a management system of some type and having it validated that you have confidence not only in your historic data, but the forecasts from this system. And then once you have that capability and you're confident in it, then you have the opportunity to look at multiple scenarios. And I won't go into this example because our second speaker today will be getting into this exact example from Connecticut DOT. But the opportunity to look at different funding scenarios or different strategic scenarios and understand what that might mean for your future performance and consider all of that in your target setting process. So I will say that with each of these methods that I've just gone through, there are some common challenges across all of them, particularly related to bridge target setting. Some of these pertain to the national measures themselves, the data behind the national measures, and others are due to the way the bridges deteriorate and the way that we manage and address that deterioration. One of the issues is that, and we'll mention it now, and I'm sure our speakers will get into it as well, the federal targets are 2 to 4 year time frame. And we recognize that this can be a challenge in itself for a couple of reasons. First, bridges deteriorate slowly. So 4 years is maybe 5% of a new bridge's expected service life. So across your population of bridges, there just isn't necessarily that much change in condition naturally in a 4 year time span. So that leads to a challenge in setting those types of near-term targets. Second, bridge conditions are most directly impacted by rehabilitation and replacement actions. And those actions are major construction efforts, and they take several years to plan, design, and construct before they can be inspected, and the benefits in terms of condition can be seen in the data. So most of the decisions that will affect your bridge conditions 2 to 4 years from now have probably already been made. So to account for this across all of these target setting approaches, the guide discusses the need to use longer term forecasts, and recommending looking coupled with your asset management plan, 10 years or even more into the future, and understand long-term trends and strategies for addressing those trends. All right. So with that, there's an overview of the approaches in the guide. I'm going to pause here before introducing our speakers because we have a couple poll questions as we get into the presentations, just to get a sense of who's joined us today and what your experiences are with setting bridge condition targets. So Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, could you please bring up poll 1? So which of the 5 approaches that I've just described and is described in the guide closest fits your agency's target setting process? Speaking for bridges, as we recognize, you may employ multiple processes for different assets or different performance areas. I still have some answers coming in. I know some of you may be right in the middle of target setting right now, as we're the 2021 data is being validated or has just been validated, and we're getting ready to report those by the end of September. Others may be thinking back to 2018. All right. So I see things are slowing down a little bit. We've got more than half of the folks who have answered. So, yeah, Sarah, can we publish the results, or do I just, there we go. Thank you. So yeah, so you can see a pretty good mix. And we've got better than a third, the largest plurality, I guess, to model or system based. So getting an understanding of what's our expected level of investment, and then using our bridge management system to forecast expected performance, and then using the near-term results of that analysis to set targets. But we do have 10 agencies, or I guess maybe folks from the same agency, but 10 folks who are familiar with the scenario analysis approach. So that's great. Really, they're the same approach. It's just how many different scenarios you run. But you can also see a mix of the simpler approaches, and very often, depending on your confidence in your bridge management systems, or your confidence in being able to show the near-term implications of changes that you're putting in place, those simpler approaches can absolutely be effective in setting targets. So great. It's good to see we have a good mix today. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that. And I think we have one more poll, a follow up to this one.
Actually, Brad, I think that's all we have.
Oh, we only have that one? Okay, no worries. All right, so with that, then we're ready for our presentation. So we have two presenters from states who present on examples how they employed long-term thinking to establish effective bridge condition targets. So I'll be introducing each of our speakers now, and then after starting with Justin's presentation, we'll have an opportunity for questions after each presentation. And then following the presentations, we'll have some, discussion questions for all of you, with the hopes of prompting a discussion that will not only allow, everybody participating today to enhance their target setting practices, but also help us finish the guide. So very excited to have a discussion following our presentations. Excuse me. So our first presentation will be by Justin Bruner, who is the asset management engineer with Pennsylvania DOT. Justin has been with Pennsylvania DOT for 11 years. In addition to working as the asset management engineer for PennDOT, he is also a member of FHWA's Transportation Asset Management Expert Task Group. And another fact about Justin, he's also an avid car enthusiast and currently restoring a vintage Porsche 911. So that might be a presentation for a different day. But so Justin will be presenting on PennDOT's practices, and then following Justin, we have Jacob Booth from Connecticut DOT. Jacob has 10 years of experience working with inspections, maintenance, capital projects, and software management for Connecticut DOT's highway and rail bridges. Within the last year, Jacob also took on the role of bridge asset steward and lead of bridge management. So with that, he's managing the federal data compliance, transportation asset management plan projections and documentations, and project creation. So I thank both of them for being here today. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand things over to Justin.
There we go. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, let me get this up and running. Okay, and can you see my presentation in presentation mode? I'll take silence as a yes.
I'm not sure that I can.
Do you want to try sharing that again? I'll remove your spotlight.
Okay, let's try that again. Share.
Perfect.
Yep, now you see
Yes.
and seeing in presentation mode.
Yes, great.
Excellent. All right, there we go. All right, thanks, Brad. I am Justin Bruner, the asset management engineer here at PennDOT, and today we're going to talk about performance targets. So as Brad noted earlier, I guess I'm preservation focused in both my personal life and my professional life. So that reflects in our target setting methodology. But in relation to performance targets, PennDOT has had a wide variety of experience in setting performance targets. We have a long history of this. So we're going to go through the past, present, and future performance targets here at the DOT. So our previous processes, a lot of them were informal, sort of kind of make it up as you go, and eventually they sort of got consolidated and formalized. But they also sort of focused and consolidated around this one concept at PennDOT, and that was along about 2008. We had a high of 6,034 poor bridges. Back then we called them structurally deficient. But yeah, that was the threshold in which we said that enough's enough and we need to do something about this. We were the highest in the country. So our focus was on poor bridges. And also along about that time, we had some new federal money that came out, ARA, AVP. So we worked to really try to influence the selection of bridges to be poor bridges and to reduce that number of overall poor. One thing I want to call out on this graph, there is some really great management techniques here utilized. We call this the USA Today friendly version. So if you cut your x-axis off a little bit, it does make you look like you've achieved slightly more than you have, even though you haven't. This is the version that comes out of our shop, and this is from a later time, but it's completely allowable to take off that x-axis and it looks like you've come down a whole lot further. Just food for thought. Anyway, so we achieved this reduction in overall poor by implementing what was later referred to as the LPN graphs or the LPN papers or linking planning and NEPA. So fundamentally what these are it's a two-sided piece of paper that has everything you could ever possibly want to know about your district. This is the statewide total, but basically where you fall in relation to the overall state goals, right? So it's two-sided. If you look on the other side here, you'll notice that really it comes down to fundamentally we're really focusing on that count and deck area. And of course, these reports will come out green if you're doing it optimum threshold, yellow if you're cautionary, and red if you are not meeting it. So this is actually a really great methodology to utilize if you have excess money or there's money set aside for these types of goals. But it's probably not the best type of performance target to utilize when you don't have enough cash, because really then people start to try to figure out how to, and for lack of better terms, game the system so that you can try to meet these while still meeting other goals and targets that they're held to. It's a thing when you start talking about performance measures, right? You have to serve all your different masters. So fundamentally, these were really great early on when we had dedicated funding. A lot of things were going on. Not so great toward the end. And really what happened next was that in 2015, we came up with this concept of the governor's goal. So the administration worked with the governor's office to come up with something good PennDOT could do, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, we now have this governor's bridge goal of delivering 1,500 poor bridges in 4 years. That's a really substantial goal to meet, right? And it was going to take a lot of effort on our behalf. There was a lot of internal collaboration and effort to really make this happen, because it was really a stretch for us to achieve this. It was also a stretch to actually monitor it. So we came up with this bridge asset management SD bridge tracking sheet. And this was also made for every district. Actually, I think we broke it down even to every county. But we actually went through and tracked the actual let of each bridge that counted toward that goal. And it was then checked and verified to make sure it was in fact poor at the time and counted toward the goals, all that kind of good stuff. Lots of manual effort there. As a DOT, we were a bit of an overachiever. We did achieve more than we wanted to. We achieved over 1,800. So good for us in achieving that. But really, this particular bridge goal started the discussion internally at PennDOT to say, hey, we're really banging out these poor bridges, but is really focusing just solely on poor the way to really manage our stuff, right? This is also about the times you see the dates on here that our TAMPs are starting to become due. So there's more of an asset management talk, discussion, thought, focus, if you will. So up until that point in time, we constantly communicated with these sort of quarterly updates of graphs of where we were, historic trends, that sort of thing, track what we did. But we also had online performance measures that were utilized in actual people's EPRs, right? You really didn't want to be red, so people still had to focus on that poor delivery even after we met that governor's performance goal. So what had happened is that in the end, we did deliver a substantial amount of bridges, right? We got down to below 2,500, which is really an impressive feat for us overall. But the question is at what cost, right? So we failed to provide the level of preservation we probably should have in that point of time, but that's okay. We still needed to, this still needed address. We were really behind in our number of poor. So this sort of all spurred the discussion for us to move to our current process. And of course, current process is based off of MAP 21 guidelines, right? So you can't have less than 10%, or you should have less than 10% poor in the NHS. There's minimum conditions for interstate only bridges. We did establish those targets, and no more than 5% of a bridge data should be unreported or missing. Totally agree with all that. I don't necessarily agree with less than 10% on the NHS, but that's okay. That's something we can work towards because we're, at least for now, not going to cross that threshold. What we do strongly agree with is that these goals are in the context of lowest life cycle cost. And that's something I believe most of my colleagues and I believe in, because fundamentally, if you're looking for more money, if you are in a financially constrained environment and you need to come up with more cash, right? The best thing to do is be more efficient with your cash currently, get you more down the road. It's a really great first step to showing that you can invest properly and hopefully get more investment from the Fed later. At any rate, our current communication strategy has changed substantially. So we went and we've completely gone away from talking about just the number of poor. Okay, so now we talk historically about where we've been, but in good, fair, and poor. And that's important because it gives you context, right? And in this particular graph, we're also, this is count. We also provide this by deck area, which is the one I normally reference, but we didn't have the count other by deck area, so it's all good. But anyway, in this lower graph, you'll see that our good, fair, and poor, the solid lines represent things that actually have happened. That's what we've achieved in the last couple of years. The lighter lines represent where we think we're going to go based on our asset management systems and our financial guidance. So when we put our financial guidance into our systems, it tells us what we think is going to happen into the future. So this is how we try to communicate now where we are. We get our information from our bridge asset management system. This is a homegrown system developed here at PennDOT. We call it BridgeCare. Our BridgeCare, I feel as if, is on par with most commercial offerings, and it gives us everything that we need to manage our structures, including tons and tons of financial data. It gives us a recommended treatment per structure per year for every year of our analysis, which is pretty big. So one of the shortcomings of using a bridge asset management system to set your targets is that they don't necessarily align out of the gate with reality, right? So the poorly drawn red line here, I'm not so good with mouse, that's showing what BridgeCare thinks is going to happen. And the green line that I put on there, at least for 21 and 22, is about where we think we are in reality, right? So they're off by this sort of constant, if you will. So what we're trying to do is rectify that and figure out, okay, so we need to bring down our overall projections, largely because we know factually that we only have so many poor, let's say, and fair currently. This is largely a relic, an outcome of having this massive system ingesting data, making these big projections. And it turns out that it's just kind of hard to get the first couple of years just right. I mean, we've looked at this problem 6 ways from Sunday, and it turns out that every time we run it, every time we think we've gotten more and better data, more accurate forecasts, and everything looks great, we can't quite match reality in the first couple of years, right? First couple. You're making a long-term projection. So really what the systems are really good at is showing you your trends into the future. And that's really important, but then you need to bring those trends down and actually make them goals. So here's what we're looking at into the future. So our system tells us. This is based off of, again, our financial guidance. And at the time when I made this graph, we were assuming inflation was at 3%. So this graph probably was going to look a lot different in the future now, because we know that inflation has changed. We'll probably have a lot less buying power in the future. So it could likely look very worse unless we get more money, in which case that would then come back down. But in the very near term, when we're talking about federal performance measures, those first couple of years, we're still good. So we're okay with that. This is a sample output on how we actually communicate those manually created numbers. So if you look at it here, we have good, fair, and poor. You give it by count and deck area. This is a statewide total. But this is the part in which we actually take our overall systems outputs, sort of do the engineering analysis to figure out, correlate that, bring it back down to where we think that starting point should be, and then distribute that out among all the districts. So you'll notice that in here, this is a bulb of that, we are about 4.5% actual versus our 6% target, right? So we're about 1.5% off, which is how we're starting with that adjustment. And note that in my previous targets, I had targets that were increasing. I still expect to produce increasing targets because the slope of that line before is still going to go up. It's just a matter of, are we really starting at 4.5? We're going to start at 5. Is that going to go to 6? That's how we have to figure that part out based on our outputs and some engineering judgment. This is a screenshot of that massive spreadsheet that we use to actually determine where we think those particular good, fair, poor percentages should go throughout the state. So when you start to create these programs, you have to think, okay, we've created this goal. How does that goal get distributed out to all the different NPOs, RPOs, districts, right? So that's, again, where that engineering analysis comes in. You have to look at and think about, budget and capacity, current condition, right? Do they have a lot of poor bridges? Do they not have a lot of poor bridges? Can they afford to reduce more, or do they not have money to give to meet these overall goals? Again, it's a very manual effort for us, and I feel as if there's a lot that can be done to improve that process. So just in summary, we are less than 10% poor, so we're not in danger of any sort of issues currently, but I see that happening in the future. We do also set targets for fair and good, so that's really good. And again, there are those inherent issues with this process, right? That equity among the districts and how you distribute it. There's a lot of information analysis that goes into that. It's actually quite difficult. So with that in mind, let's talk about where I think we should go into the future. So right now, in our overall planning process, we have BAMs and PAMs, okay? And we have a couple other systems in place. And what we've started to work on is what we call Project Builder. And that's a system that sits on top of both of our BAMs and our PAM systems, and it consumes their outputs, stitches them together, and makes draft projects. That's kind of important to note because all systems create recommended treatments. It's really hard to forecast your overall future conditions based just on treatments. You need to do projects. So why is that important? Well, let's face it. Let's say that a bridge is recommended for replacement in, say, 4 years from now. But that pavement section that it resides in is going to get let next year. It's possible that replacement may actually qualify for rehab versus a replacement, or vice versa. If you're going to work in a section many years later, that preservation activity may have delayed to a rehab activity. So it's really difficult to project exactly what happens out in the future when you start to combine these things into projects, because that's how DOTs turn cash into assets, right? Projects. So if we can create draft projects, let's say 85% draft projects that can be finished off by the local NPO, RPO that contain all the great recommended outputs, that actually helps us in predicting our overall conditions in the future. It also helps us be much more efficient on how we allocate that money. So one of the great things about this is that not only can you consume bridge and pavement information, but now you can consume other things into that as well. So safety and mobility and equity and all those other things that go into project selection. So now you can rank these things on a more uniform scale, and you can show the cost associated with achieving all of those goals, which is sort of an added benefit for us. But fundamentally, in the end, how we intend to manage this is to use Project Builder to create a draft STIP, okay? That STIP is then fundamentally something people can work off of, but then we can fund people's STIPs based on buckets of preservation, rehabilitation, maintenance, replacement money, right? So we say, well, it looks like this STIP that came out has 22% preservation. So if you select 22% preservation projects, you will likely be compliant with our overall process and our goals, right? They would have complete freedom to select whichever projects are in there, but fundamentally the systems would sort of provide some guide rails, if you will, on what can and can't be selected. So we feel that's really the way to go with this. We're not there yet, but I feel as if this is close. Hopefully we'll be utilizing this in hopefully next year. And with that, I think I'm done. Stop sharing here.
Thanks, Justin. Do we have any questions for Justin? That was a nice overview. I like the past, present, and future approach you took there. Covered a lot of ground, though. So, any questions?
Brad, I just wanted to add that people can either put their questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask your questions to Justin.
So I guess I'll get things rolling. So what is your greatest challenge before you, I think, at this point? What to achieve the future that you've laid out? What's going to be your biggest hurdle?
I feel as if that working towards acceptance with all of this internally is likely going to be the biggest hurdle. The technology, it exists, it's out there. We just need to stitch it all together and work with it. But change is hard in DOT, and rightfully so, because there's a lot of moving pieces. There's always unintended consequences. But I believe the actual implementation of moving from how we program now to a more futuristic version of this, buckets of money. I think that just the overall implementation, that's going to be the biggest challenge.
Right. I think I have one more, and it's on the bridge management system. I liked your hand-drawn graph comparing where your model is forecasting you'll be, but maybe the more realistic kind of where you are, and continuing the trend from there. And I was just talking with some colleagues this morning that is really common, and I don't know that we talk about it much in asset management systems, that they seem to be a conservative bias in the forecasts of, and it's not just bridge management systems. And I think we see it. What are your thoughts on maybe what are some of the potential causes of that, or what can an agency do to maybe minimize that? Or
so I think we can get around it. I think part of the problem is fundamentally it's time bound, right? So there are things in the pipeline now that are happening that we may not have captured and entered into our system. So we have the ability to load committed projects into our bridge management system, and it effectively executes those. But I think in the first year or two, there's always a little bit of hiccup as to what year it thinks it's actually going to execute it, and then when it's done. Also, we have this concept of cash flow in our asset management system, where based on the total value, it cash flows that bridge project out for 2 or 3 or 4 years and doesn't count the increase in condition till the end of that period. So you may have a really big project that may only actually take a year, but sometimes that's not accounted for. So I think there's a lot more details that need to go into the bridge data that then need to be consumed by the bridge asset management system. And I think that once we've sort of wrangled out all of those details, I think the projections will actually align much better. I mean, I think being 1.5% off is not horrible by any means, but I think we can get it down to tenths of a percent as we work to particularly modify the systems in which we keep our future work, and modify the systems that actually are contracted out now so that we can consume better data.
Great, thanks. We have a couple questions showing up in the chat now. So from Ken Miller, is PennDOT using element data for deterioration modeling or NBI general condition data?
Yeah, so right now, great question. Right now we're doing general condition data for deck supercells and culverts. The reason we haven't gone to element level at this point is because data history, right? So we've only recently had more than one cycle of element level inspection. So, I mean, I know 2 points make a line, but I need more data than that to actually make some good deterioration models and make some choices off of that. So we're actually next month going to start on the process of allowing element level conditions into the system and make decisions, make treatment and consequences off of those elements. But I'm not sure that the elements will actually get into our deterioration modeling for a number of years yet, because there's a lot more that goes into the deterioration modeling. Right now, we're using a 10-year rolling average and change of condition. That took us several years to come up with. And it probably will take several more years to actually include the quality element level data into that.
Thanks. There's a second question here, but I think we actually touched on it with the first, and that was, did you use deterioration models in bridge care? And if so, what challenges did you have for deterioration modeling? But I think you just kind of touched on those. And with the change in data type from component to element, for those who are not fully indoctrinated into bridge inspection speak, and I will say I'm one of those, the component level data is establishing a numeric rating, looking at the deck, the superstructure, the substructure, or if it's a culvert type bridge for the culvert barrel. And then the element level is actually a different numeric rating system, but you're looking at individual elements within each of those components and rating the individual elements. And there's a lot more differences than that, but it's a lot more detailed data. And we just started collecting that nationally in 2016. Is that about right for the element level data?
Maybe your way to say that is that basically we're getting a percent defect, right? So before you could have a substructure rated as poor because only one of those piers has a problem with it, and you may have 100 piers on the bridge. So if you know quantity, that really impacts your overall decision making.
Thanks, Justin. And the next question, what type of deterioration models did you use?
We use deterministic. Probabilistic will not easily, realistically let you do a analysis per treatment per year. So if you want to get more into the deterioration modeling, I built our system because I felt to utilize as many deterioration models as necessary. We have an individual deterioration model for the top 500 structures because they represent such high risk and such influence on our overall population. From there, we have deterioration models per district and per family for every district in the Commonwealth because they do vary considerably by district. And of course, you're going to have them vary by steel and concrete, pre-stress, that kind of stuff too, right? It did present some limitations. Once you get to a point where your population pool becomes so small, then you don't have enough bridges. That's about 5. So we do have to, add some statewide averages into that. But I do feel that more deterioration models are better than less, particularly on the bigger stuff. There's like 30 and 40 footers, which we have literally 10,000 of. They're all generally the same and they'll perform about the same. But the larger structures really need those individualistic models. The multi-span really need its own model.
Thanks. I think we have one more question from Ken Miller. So how does the PennDOT BMS deal with the first year problem of NBI deterioration modeling? That approximately half of all bridges will be past their anticipated time of next downward transition.
Okay. So I think what you're asking about is what we call seeded values. So when you go through and you have a series of bridges, right, and you have, you pull them all in, right? We actually have time in condition for all of them. So like, let's say that you have 100 bridges, right? And the average is 50, right? That's probably not a good way to explain that. We actually know how long something has been in a current condition rating, okay? So we utilize that time frame, called time and condition rating. And we actually change our overall rating according to the time it's been in that rating. So we have, for example, a poor bridge is a 4.00 to a 4.99. A bridge that just turned 4 is a 4.99. A bridge that's just going to turn 3 is a 4.0. Where it lands in there is based on how long it's been there. We have enough data in the system to know that if it's been there for 25 years, it's probably a 4.25. If it's just turned 4, it will be a 4.99, and depending on the type of bridge, it will deteriorate down accordingly. I hope that helps.
Thanks. I think that makes sense to me, certainly. All right. Well, thanks, Justin. I think that was a great presentation, and thanks for your helpful answers. So I think now that'll bring up our second presentation by Jacob Booth from Connecticut DOT. Welcome, Jacob.
All right. So today I have the opportunity to share with you the process that ComDOT is using to set our bridge condition targets. A similar process is used actually for all 11 of the assets in our TAM. Our process is something that is ever evolving. It's something we've been working on over the last 4 years, and every year we add a little bit more, tweak this or that to improve our process as we go. So each year we begin the process with running 3 primary budget scenarios in our deterioration software: our current anticipated funding, a no funding scenario, and a preferred funding level that will help us reach our long-term goals of state of good repair. Additionally, we run 2 bonus budgets, a 25% more funding and a 25% less funding, just to give us an idea of what could potentially happen if money is moved from bridges to regular highway projects or regular highway projects over to bridge projects. All these scenarios include a mix of existing projects already in design or construction and projects recommended by DTIM's, our deterioration software, to provide a full budget utilization, and we run this over a 30-year period. Existing project data is pulled from our project management software. We use construction completion dates to try and get a best handle of when we'll be taking advantage of the benefits. ComDOT's also evaluating a migration to BRM to model our deterioration and funding resources, as there seems to be some better integration with our existing inspection and bridge project management software. We plan to run softwares in parallel for at least a few years to see where the performance differences are and evaluate a best path forward. So from there, we take the results of the anticipated funding scenario, and then we use those to create a more refined future performance projection of the next 30 years, with most of our emphasis being on the next 10 years. This is performed by comparing the anticipated budget to the do-nothing budget. By the nature of how our deployment of DTIMs is set up, results of projects are pretty much instantaneous. As soon as a bridge is assigned work kit, we get credit for the work. This is acceptable for the out years, but really for the first 5 years, the construction could still be ongoing, the inspection may not occur the moment construction is complete, or we may not have the NBI data in time to view it in the projections. This helps to smooth over either an initial steep drop or an initial steep increase. We also kind of adjust our initial few years based on our historical trends. So we'll see for the first few years that it might, jump up a whole percentage or down a whole percentage from where we are currently, and we know that realistically, nothing is going to change our percentages by that much. So when Bridge and Asset Management are satisfied with the results of all of our modeling and minor modifications, the whole of the projections are presented to our chief engineer and additional administrative staff. This allows the head office to be apprised of our current bridge conditions, aware of how our historical data is trending, and what we are projecting based on our current proposed funding levels. Final adjustments may be made at this level to our targets based on judgment of the administrative staff, what they've seen historically, and what they expect us to realistically achieve. We're very lucky at the moment where our head of engineering is a dyed-in-the-wool rich guy, and he sees a lot of benefit to
Hey,
invest.
Jacob, can I
Yes.
interrupt you for a sec?
Yeah.
We're hearing a really loud background noise. I can barely hear your voice. There's some sort of electronic transmission sound. Is that anything on your end? Do you have a fan going or something?
It might be. Hold on me.
That got dramatically better.
Well, I'm muted, so I would hope so.
I see. So that's telling us it's coming from your transmission somehow. Yeah, now it's gone again.
On again? All right.
Yeah, there it's, and I hear you, and the sound is gone. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
All right. Now, I might just hop back to the start of, would you like me to kind of start over from a specific point or just kind of jump back in the middle?
I think you can keep going. I think we could
Got it.
hear you, just there was the noise in the background.
Yeah. All right. So at the same time, we set our long-term goals with the combat management. So currently we have 3 goals we're really working towards. We want to maintain less than 10% of our bridges in poor condition on the NHS by deck area. We want to maintain over 15% of our bridges rated good by deck area. And finally, we want to have 95% of our bridges in a state of good repair, which we're defining as bridges rated 5 or better, and that's by count. So here is an example of one of our asset fact sheets. This is for bridges, I want to say last year, or no, draft for this, good for us. We prepare these sheets annually to provide to the public and executive groups just to have something available so anyone can get a kind of good snapshot of our asset data. It's a high-level summary that is easily digestible by laypersons and engineers alike. So the fact sheet provides a series of definitions for how we define state of good repair, how we define our inventory, as well as what our goals mean. Additionally, at the top, you'll see there's kind of an indication of our data maturity. For bridges, our data is considered to have a high level of confidence, as this has got a well-established inspection procedure, a well-documented data dictionary, and thorough set of historical data. The current state of the asset is provided on the first page of the fact sheet, including condition data. On the second page, you start to see the performance targets prepared by the department. Performance targets are shown for a 10-year range for all federal and state performance measures. Targets are also shown annually with a more exacting measure at the bottom of each graph. The long-term goal is presented on the right, and you'll see this still says 20%. We are revising this down because no amount of money we seem to throw at the situation will ever get us to 20% good. So in this, we also show the effects of our do nothing and our preferred funding levels to accomplish all work. So just kind of as a zoom in on one of these, we'll look at our projected performance for bridges in NHS good condition. We've been tracking the actual performance. This is a track of the actual performance since we started performing the TAMP, as well as where our 2-year and 4-year targets have landed and the 5-year short projections at every point. Starting with the yellow line, that's our actual asset performance for the past 5 years now. Having this historical information laid out as a precursor to our projections helps us identify any swings that are unrealistic. This can be seen in our first year model, this dark blue line. Without much historical precedence in our modeling, our targets greatly overestimated our actual performance. So from there, we learned that we should probably be slowly ramping in the budget to the model, refining our cost data to make sure it's actually capturing all of the externalities of a bridge project, and refining how our inflation and discount rates are included in the model. From there, we saw results that much more closely lined up with our real performances. You can see as these blue lines get lighter, they also seem to line up more closely with our actual performances. So by combining those processes previously, we've managed to get our 2 and 4 year targets fairly closely lined up with what we're seeing in reality. And we're more and more confident that we'll be able to achieve these 2 and 4 year projection targets. I'll stress again, these are our performance targets. They're outside of our performance goals. We're still aiming to have over 15% of our bridges good condition, less than 10% poor, and the 95% state of good repair. Similar graph to show what's going on with the NHS poor bridges. We had 2 years of pretty large performance increases. Our bridge administrator at the time was very aggressive about initiating projects on poor bridges, getting the work done, and getting our inspection crews out there to decrease the conditions. So that's why we have this steep curve for the first 2 years, and then it's kind of metered out over the next 3 or 4. We don't anticipate getting such a steep curve again. We're going to continue trying to stay on a steady decline as opposed to these sharp drops. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of additional cost to kind of run things that way. So finally, our state of good repair line, you'll see it's steadily working its way upwards. We're projecting in the out years to start pulling down again. As Justin alluded to, when you chop off large portions of your x-axis, small changes are very drastic. This chart goes from 94 to 98.5. So any individual jump accounts for a lot of change. So now that we've gone through, we've documented everything we wanted, that all of our projection and targets over the last couple months, we start bringing this to our stakeholders. So our planning division holds routine monthly meetings with metropolitan planning organizations. After finalizing our targets with management, we present our current conditions, 2-year targets, and 4-year targets to the Mpos. Mpos have the option of signing on and using our DOT targets or preparing their own targets. So we present our process, our methodology, and our results, and we seek concurrence from them that they would like to sign off on the state targets or if they would like to go their own way. To date, no MPO has decided to set their own performance targets. So with our final concurrence from the combat executive team, our MPOs, and then we get some final buy-in from FHWA, the performance targets are published in the TANF and kind of serve to guide and inform people over the next several years. A brief presentation there. Any questions? I'd love to address them now.
All right, thanks, Jacob. That was great, and I know the process that you just summarized for us, I think, has been cited in, and we use it, we reference it in the draft guide, and I think it's been cited in more research about target setting than probably any other approach, and it's very well documented in the 2019 Connecticut Transportation Asset Management Plan as well. So another source for folks. Any questions? There's a couple. I did miss a question for Justin, and I see a follow-up question, but I'll get to those in a minute. If there's any questions for Jacob on the Connecticut process. And I guess I'll ask a little bit on the one of the more subjective areas. You initially mentioned that you have the 3 different scenarios that you look at. What's your internal process for determining exactly how you define those scenarios? Whether it's just coming up with the fact that there's 3 of them, or setting inputs to define those 3 scenarios.
So the existing budget scenario is fairly straightforward. That's what we've been seeing with externalities included of what a bridge, how much we're spending annually on bridges. It's not perfect. It varies up to 100 million per year, but it averages out to about 375 million per year spent on structures. 0% budget is very easy. We don't do any work and we see what happens over the next 30 years. The third budget is where things start to get really complicated. It usually requires several budget runs. We'll run a first trial budget, typically at 2 times our current budget, and see if that scenario keeps us in that 95% state of good repair over the 30-year period. And then we'll kind of keep bumping up the funding steadily until it maintains that 95% state of good repair over the 30-year period. It's not perfect, especially in the out years. Inflation really starts eating into the budget, and you hit a point where no matter how much money you throw at the situation, it just can't keep up. We're currently running ours at 3.8% inflation to try and have an average over the 30 years that matches historical inflation plus the inflation we've seen over the past year. And 25% more or less was, I want to say, on a whim from management back in the day, but it did work out where the 25% more wind up fairly closely with where we are now for HMO.
Oh, good point. So it was, I guess, foresight, we can say now, that led you to that scenario. Great. All right. I do see, here's, well, oh, the hand went down. Okay. So from Clint Beck, how does Connecticut DOT connect the asset management system recommended treatments into projects? Do you use the asset management system recommendations for target setting or actual projects planned in future years?
So perfect time to ask this. Up until 2 years ago, we were very much a worst first state. It was as bridges became poor, or bridges that were poor, we programmed projects on those to get them out of poor condition. Because of how aggressively we've been targeting poor bridges, last year we actually started targeting bridges in fair or better condition. And that's a combination of our bridge inspection group's judgment of what bridges are likely to continue falling in condition rating, and the recommendations out of D10 for when bridges are going to fall poor, and then what treatments we could take to prevent them from falling poor. So that's something new we're really starting to try out this past year and this year, and I suppose we'll find out how it works 10 years from now.
Great, thanks. All right, so Kent has asked the same questions he had the first time around. And so the first one was, is Connecticut DOT using element data for deterioration modeling or NBI general condition data?
So we're still with we're still with overall condition data, component level condition data. We have the historical information to justify that. I know BRM has some kind of built-in element level deterioration that it can do. I'm not sure how confident anyone is in that yet.
Thanks. I think we just put, Kent, we just unmuted you. So yeah, if you'd like to
Hi,
clarify
Jacob.
or, go ahead.
I have those questions because I think every DOT struggles with those because our performance measures are in terms of the general condition ratings for deck, super sub, and culvert. But our easiest data to use for deterioration modeling is element data. And so if you stay with what we do, if you stay with the NBI data, then you run into that problem of how do you handle all those bridges that have exceeded the time and state for the condition they are in. So for example, if a bridge is anticipated to transition from a 6 to a 5 in 15 years, and you go and look at that bridge, well, you find that and that's the average amount of time it takes bridges to do that for your network. Well, about half of the bridges that are in that situation are going to be above average or below average. They're not going to fit that model. And so the question is, the first year problem, how do you deal with those bridges that have been in that condition for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years in your first year of modeling?
All right, so I think I'm going to answer it how I think we've handled this, and you can tell me that I'm wrong. How does that sound? We've established 3 different deterioration curves for all of our overarching structure types. So we have a curve that looks at our structures and assigns a curve for if a bridge has been in a condition state longer than we anticipated to have been in. We have our standard curve, and then we have a poor performance curve. So this is bridges that are deteriorating faster than we would expect them to. These were gone through and I believe manually assigned, manually being gone through with a spreadsheet. And if this has been in a condition state longer than we would have expected for the curve, it was assigned a good curve, and then vice versa for the bad curve. Also reset the curves based on types of recommended projects on the bridge. So major rehabilitations, I believe, bump it up to the good curve.
Thank you. That sort of answers my question. And is the assumption there that that some bridges are just going to, if they deteriorate fast, that they're going to continue to deteriorate fast, and they should go on a faster deterioration curve, and vice versa for the slow bridges?
Yep.
Okay, because that's been pretty well studied, I think, to find if slow deterioration is a predictor of future slow deterioration. Paul Thompson did a thing on that, and some others have too. But it is a way around the problem of the first year problem that I described. If you have enough deterioration models, you just keep bumping out put it on a slower and slower model. So you can never exceed your first year. And anyway, I was just curious how you handle that. And thank you for answering my question.
So this may be an add-on to that topic. Hopefully I'm not going the wrong way at 1,000 miles an hour. We also are contracting with one of our local universities to take a look at all of our historical NBI data and develop a probabilistic deterioration curve for our structures. We'll see how that process goes. We just started, I would say 2 weeks ago now. So ask me how that goes in 5 years, I guess.
Thank you.
Thanks. We also had a question. Sorry, I'll find it. So it's a question from Jeff Neal, and I think thinking that speaking on behalf of the non-DOTs, appreciate that, Jeff, who are involved in target setting and interested in taking a next step. Presents a situation that a bridge investment program suggests funding can be applied to a bridge in fair condition that's expected to become poor within the next 3 years. In the absence of deterioration models, how might NBI data trends be used to identify those types of bridges? So any suggestions as agencies are getting started, I guess, and Jeff, let me know if you'd like to expand on that question of how the data can be applied to help with treatment selection and also that then relates to target setting for bridges.
So I think this is going to be unfortunately a case of everyone's FHWA rep is going to be a little different in what they will allow you to get by with. We've had some preliminary conversations with ours, and they are very accepting of us using BRM and continuous projections. It seems to be an and/or, but can't get full clarity on that. Using those projections to say when something will fall too poor and letting us program construction projects to be in advance of when they're anticipated to go forward by a small margin.
Okay. Thanks. And then Justin, that question was originally for you. I think I'm kind of curious if you have any further insights on.
Okay, so I would say that if you don't have deterioration modeling readily available, then I would look at your MBI data and rank them in terms of shortest to longest in that current condition, and then you can figure out the ones in the bottom of the list are likely the ones you want to focus, because the MBI still has that information in there as to their duration, their condition state.
Yeah. The other, and thanks, that's a good point. And then I think one thing I'll just add is that remember that the models, in particular when you're looking at them for recommending treatment selection, it is just that it's recommended, and then that just initiates the process of, is this a reasonable project, and getting it into the queue for further engineering evaluation to determine exactly what that bridge may need in the short and long term, and then comparing that to other projects that have also been other project candidates that have been identified. So, all right. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Just as a thought, I haven't actually experimented with this, but you might be able to get by if it's on your NBI submittal, relying on the FHWA info bridge system. They do have some deterioration predictions, I believe, so that might provide some assistance in that front.
A starting point.
Yeah.
So Kent has asked to be curious if any agencies, if you know of any agencies that are targeting bridges in fair condition due to deck conditions that could be upgraded to good condition by relatively low cost repairs. I can answer that one. And prior to joining Applied Pavement Technology, I was with New York State DOT for a couple decades, and New York State DOT has a longstanding bridge maintenance strategy that they call vertical down. And this dates back to a large number of the interstate era bridges, which are simple span bridges, where in the Northeast with de-icing chemicals, deterioration happens from salty water starting at leaky joints, and it deteriorates the deck. It then deteriorates it can corrode bearings, deteriorate pedestals, deteriorate your substructure, and it happens in that order as elements are exposed to the de-icing chemicals. And so they do have a standard procedures for looking for that type of deterioration, identifying deteriorations in the deck and particularly in joints, and trying to address those as early as possible before the damage can happen below. But then similarly recognizing that if you have that damage, you need to do the deck repairs, you need to do the joint repairs, and you need to do the minor repairs underneath to restore the bridge condition. And if you can arrest that early, you can add quite a bit of life to the bridges. And I see, is that Kent with his hand raised? Go ahead. I think you're unmuted.
Oh, thanks. I just forgot to take my hand down.
Oh.
But I'm sort of curious about that, just because I've wondered if by setting these performance targets, if that is deriving strategies to achieve the targets. I'm not saying it's necessarily a best practice to target decks. For example, if you have super and sub that are in good condition and your deck is in a 6, driving the bridge into fair condition, that would be a fairly low cost candidate to do work on to push that back up into a 7 or 8 and get it up into a good part of your performance measures. However, it's probably a lot cheaper to get in there and hit that deck when it's a 7 or 8, get some aggressive preservation on that thing so it never does get down to a 6 if you have a way to do it. So I'm not suggesting that trying to game the performance targets is a good way to go, but I'm just kind of curious if people find themselves doing it. I know we're looking at that because we're having a lot of bridges. The number in fair condition has been increasing, and we're close to not making our targets for bridges in good condition.
Yeah, Justin or Jacob, any thoughts on that? And I think the element level data helps target things that may be driving those component ratings that are related to the target, maybe help you find what could be fixed to bump those ratings up. Any thoughts on any strategies you're employing in that regard?
So we look at everything as lowest life cycle cost. So we're measuring increase in life per investment, and the work on the decks, always, particularly preservation on the decks, is always best value. So that generally is selected when applicable above anything else, because that gives you the most extension of your life for the least amount of cost. So if we look at our outputs, there is substantial preservation in there, and it is mainly on the decks.
First, I'd like to hire your inspectors that have your bridges deck condition increase after repairs. That would be nice.
Yeah.
I can speak to that if I'm still unmuted.
Go ahead.
We have, Nebraska, as you may know, has gone big in with asphalt and waterproofing membranes, because we have a group of about 30 bridges that have had that treatment on them since the 1970s that have really not changed at all in their condition. Deck, super, and sub are all still 8s and 9s.
Awesome.
And we really can't find other peers of that age that we can even compare them to. The survival rate is so high for the decks especially. So, but the big resistance to doing that on the state level was the tension between preservation. On one hand, we have a method that we think works to preserve things well, but observation on the other hand, if you're covering up that bridge, you can't see it anymore. And so what if we're doing this on bridges that have already been exposed to chlorides for a while? These are the bridges that this was done on in the 70s, had never been open to traffic when it was applied. So we're doing it on new bridges, but we have most of the bridges that had some service history, of course. So the question is, how reliable will this method be when there are already chlorides present, if you can just keep the moisture out? And we don't really have a good answer on that yet. We're working on it, but we're not super confident. So, but because of this situation where we're doing good quality repairs on the deck before placing that asphalt membrane, that happens between inspections, we wrote into our policy that we will, in the office, increase deck by up to 2 condition points. If it's a 7, it goes up to a 9. If it's a 6, it goes up to an 8. And then the inspector, if they come along and they see something that the overlays in a hole or the bottom of the deck is in terrible condition, they can always downgrade it again based on what they see in the field. But because they can't see it, and the assumption is that the repairs were done under contract, we're going to get some benefit from that. Otherwise, we're doing something that has a cost and no benefit. So it's a policy thing there as well. So I guess is my point. We're not trying to game the system, but we are trying to get credit for the good that we're doing.
Sure.
So Jeff Neal's added in the comments, with the encouragement for bridge bundling for the bridge improvement program, the packaging of top-down deterioration approach sounds like an interesting system-based method that Mpos or locals could supplement DOT's efforts. So that is one I guess, and Kent, to you as well, when you're looking at these types of preservation approaches, where you're only addressing one component of the bridge, does that enable you to bundle and find economies of scale, whether it's through the deck sealing or the deck treatments, or maybe other component specific rehabs? Or anybody, and you raise your hand if you've got an answer to that one. I think we've got some pretty smart and knowledgeable folks in our audience today. So,
well, I can sort of speak to that. We do bundle high asset value bridges for preservation work, and that's about the only thing we do for that type of work. We don't bundle replacements particularly, or redecks or rehabs. Instead, we let the roadway conditions drive the timing of the work. So we never would repair a bridge unless it's in conjunction with a pavement project. Just because we want to disrupt the traffic for just the bridge's purpose, and so we design the bridge work to last at least as long as the interval anticipated for pavement needs, which is about 15 years. Every 15 years, they're going to be doing something on that roadway. So I don't know if that counts as bundling or not, but we're coordinating with another type of activity, a pavement-driven activity.
Yeah, I think that counts. Slightly different, but yeah, it's finding those efficiencies. Jacob or Justin, thoughts on bundling for preservation to help meet your condition objectives?
We've actually put out bundling projects for preservation. We found that to be pretty successful because we have a lot of structures. There's 25,400 state-owned structures here in PA. So there's a lot of opportunity. We've also bundled that P3 project that you saw in the graphs earlier. We replaced 558 smaller bridges under that bundle contract. So we have a good bit of success. We also even have a bundling provision that allows PennDOT to take ownership of locals so that we could administer the contract for them, put it all in place, build it, and then sign it back over to them. So yeah, we're big fans of geographic bundling for contract.
Great, thanks.
Follow on to that, we're really starting to lean into trying to do bundling as well. We recently put out bundles for painting along the entire Bridgeport and along entire interstate routes. We just recently put out a bundle to do deck repairs along another interstate, and put out a bundle to just wholesale replace joints along another. With those all consistent AV.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? I think then we're at 3:30. So this has been a great discussion. We've got some discussion questions I'm going to put up on the screen, and I think we can start the discussion. I'll put Jacob and Justin on the spot to start the discussion as we go through these, but I would encourage, I'm going to walk through each of these questions for all participants to please contribute. You can feel free to, maybe I should have had a slide each for these. We'll just some things to walk through. But as we go through them, if you have something to add, or if you'd like to contribute, please raise your hand. You can, we'll unmute you, or you can feel free to contribute in the chat. So, and particularly this first one, we've got a couple different approaches for target setting that Justin and Jacob related to us between the model-based and also the scenario analysis. But I'm curious, when it comes to states, we certainly have, based on the polling results, states or other agencies that have used each of the other three methods, and potentially others. That's the other thing. There's a whole spectrum, I meant to mention that, of approaches to target setting. And these are 5 categories that we've decided to highlight, but there's certainly, you can use more than one of these approaches and compare the results, or you may have an approach that's a bit of a hybrid of these different approaches. So, you know, it's don't want to present that these are the only 5 ways that you can go about informing your target setting process. But with that, you know, what are kind of the challenges and benefits you found with the method of target setting you've taken? So what's and so I guess I'll pose that to Jacob and then Justin. So looking at your approaches, what is one of the major challenges you've had in implementing this approach, or what's maybe a benefit to having gone through this process of setting your targets?
Sure. So I guess a recent challenging we're certainly experiencing in Connecticut is staffing related, where everyone who was involved in this retired or left and went over to something else. And we're kind of picking up where they left off and trying our best to pick it up. So by not having an extensive set of documentation on the decisions we made and how we came to these decisions, it's address the issues as we find them in the system and document what we're doing as we're going forward. I would say the biggest benefit we've seen from this is when you can say to management, hey, this is how much money we have historically spent. This is the performance we're getting out of it. If you give us, you know, this additional chunk of money will improve our condition nationally, regionally, this amount. And being able to present that information to internal executive staff and the legislative groups and the governor's office, it really does get the ball in motion as far as procuring additional funding and getting interest in the projects.
Thanks, Jacob. Justin, thoughts?
Okay, I would say the challenges for us for our current methodology, it's pretty still labor intensive, even though we have a system in place. So you have to distribute all that out among the districts and basically the county. So there's still a fair amount of manual work involved with that. But the benefit is it's still, you know, light years ahead of where we were even a few years ago in terms of being able to, you know, honestly understand what's happening with our overall network conditions and where we're going. So yeah, pretty happy with it.
Great. Anyone in the audience interested in sharing, particularly anybody who's maybe used the trend or adjusted, you know, a trend with adjustment for funding your strategy? And if you'd like to just kind of respond in the chat with your thoughts as we go along, I think it'd be helpful for folks to see, and it'll be captured in the recording. And then we'll also be able to see if there's any insights we can incorporate into the final guide. So it does. I don't think this question necessarily applies to our 2 panelists, but for again, kind of throwing it out for discussions for folks, you know, do you or your agency, you know, wish you could use a different method, face a barrier to that? So I think Jeff Neal, for example, has been hinting at, for Mpos, not having a bridge management system configured for each of the owner's bridges, or maybe not having direct access to the state DOT's management system that has local bridges in it, might be a barrier to using the model-based or scenario analysis. So that's one we'll definitely take away. Are there others, other challenges to implementing a more technically robust target setting process?
This is Kent. I have a kind of a comment on this.
Thanks.
One thing to point out here is that we're talking with bridges where we have the 2 required targets of for percentage of bridges in good condition and percent in poor. So no less than some X number in good condition, no more than some X or X quantity in poor condition by deck area. And there's no penalty on if you fall below your upper performance targets. So the number in good condition, if that drops, nothing bad happens except maybe you have to explain it. If the other, on the poor end, if you get above 10%, then your funding, you're gonna have to justify your funding, and you might get some external involvement in what they're gonna want you to do with your funding. So I just want to make that clear that it's easier to be aspirational about a target with no penalty attached to it than it is to pick a challenging target when, if you don't meet it, you're going to get some kind of penalization.
Yeah, go ahead.
And then one of the big challenges all agencies have right now is that we're required to collect element data, but what the heck do we do with it if you can't turn it into one of your performance targets easily? So the methods of converting to good NBI, deck, super, and sub from element data are not super reliable, and I think there's some big work being done to refine those now. I know inside of BRM they're going to allow bridge component specific conversion models for going from element to NBI component. So if people can possibly refine that and get a better result. And then the other thing they're doing in BRM is they're going to display the converted value rate based on the element data. You're going to display that right next to the NBI appraisal value. So if the element data tells you that deck should be a 7, but you're saying, no, this deck's a 9, then you either need to adjust your NBI value or take a look at the element data or write an explanation in there so that the bridge management group looks at it and says, yeah, you're right, our conversion model is not accurate for this bridge. We need to change something.
Yeah, there is an FHWA, I guess it's a task order ongoing. I believe it's ongoing now. I don't know the exact status of it, to look at that problem of converting from element level ratings to component level ratings and trying to come to a common or a best practice way of doing that. That's seems to be something everybody struggles with, and there isn't necessarily a direct way of making that correlation. As we mentioned, they're kind of based on two different systems, and it's not as easy as simply rolling up all your element ratings and of 1 to 4 and then multiplying them by 2 or something to try and get to an NBI rating. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So but that's interesting to hear that there's also software updates coming to help with that and help folks process that. So I guess the next two questions get into, has your target setting process allowed you to accomplish, other things? So, have you been able to leverage a target setting or performance review process to bring about new actions to address performance? And I think that the next question kind of ties into that. What elements have made the process more effective or meaningful to your agency? So I don't know, Justin or Jacob, if you have any thoughts on that, kind of what are some of the ancillary benefits of having a good performance management approach and analysis approach?
Well, I think that probably the biggest outcome of working toward target settings has not been the actual targets themselves. It's been the message behind it, the increasing targets, because we try to use our bridge management system to forecast into the future, and I think it's probably been the biggest accomplishment, I think, with utilizing that system, is to get us off of the worst first investment practice. So I think that's probably the biggest thing we could have hoped for, and that's happened. So we're pretty happy about that.
Great.
Mostly similar to Justin. We're just a couple of years behind, but we're really trying to shift away from the worst first. having this model out there showing what's going to happen with this has been beneficial.
That's great. I guess that fits the old adage of what gets measured gets done. And as we're measuring it, we're finally getting smarter about what we're doing about it. As an industry, I guess, as collectively across the state. So that's great to hear. Any other thoughts? Again, feel free to chime in the chat. Any thoughts that you have? I see a note from Todd Shields. I think this is referring back to Kent's comment. I mean, technically correct that there aren't necessarily significant ramifications for missing your percent good target, but it still is not fun to miss a target. And I think that fits with what we just heard of the being able to implement a performance management analysis anyway to help set your targets is helping drive more informed management practices. I think this is the one thing about bridge managers, asset managers, performance managers at DOTs, and Mpos. It's a fairly passionate group for technical people in particular, and folks who have a lot of pride in their work and want to make a difference. And so I think that when we set targets, we really do want to achieve them and achieve them in an efficient way. So that's a good point. I don't think we do this lightly, as is evident with 70 to 90 folks showing up for a webinar on this topic on a Thursday afternoon. So the next question, and this one really is to the audience, and maybe we can start with a kind of a show of hands. Oh, actually, we have somebody. Let me pause though before I do that, because I see we have a, oh, we had a hand down. Let's just do a quick show of hands. We won't do a poll, but how many folks are from agencies that set a declining condition target? Or maybe this next time around are expect to set a declining condition target for bridge conditions. Just a quick show of hands. Got a few. I got about a handful. Okay, so it's not insignificant. But it looks like most folks felt that they're making headway on bridge conditions, and a few folks set declining targets. I think one of the things that we had a question as we were going through, we couldn't necessarily find instances of it, but is if you set a declining target and you still did not make progress towards that target, which means that you actually declined faster than your declining target. We're wondering if what might be the experiences of that state and how might that inform your next round of target setting. It's something that's the declining, being willing to set declining targets is a little bit, there's more tolerance for that in the infrastructure side of things than there is, particularly on the safety side of things. Even when the data may point to declining safety, folks are very hesitant to set declining safety targets. I see some responses coming in. So Todd from Indiana, the poor is improving, but the good 4-year will be slightly lower than the good 2-year. So right, that's that balance of, particularly as your preservation, you have a preservation first approach, you may be squeezing your a lot of your bridges to fair, as you're not necessarily doing the worst first, which brings them from poor to good. You may just be managing them for a longer period of time in the fair category. So that may actually be accomplishing your long-term goals, but it may be hard to communicate in a short-term target where your percent good is declining. So thanks. We had a question from Jeff Neal about blending of condition performance versus reduction. So, or elimination of bridges with low clearance or low load weight constraints. So are you focusing on those types of restrictions? This could, and you mentioned traffic volume deficiencies, could also be vulnerabilities, Jeff, I'll throw into that category. where you have bridges that may not be as resilient as you want, even though by the rating scale, they may be in fair condition or in relatively good condition. So Jacob, I see you responded to that. You use a health index to kind of cover more of those aspects of performance than condition. So I don't know, Justin, do you have a approach to that at PennDOT?
Which part, asset versus condition?
Yeah, so if we've talked about your approach to performance analysis when it comes to bridge condition, but as you're looking to address overall bridge performance, how do you bring in things like capacity, clearance, vulnerability, things like that into your process?
Right. So we're bringing in the prioritization, we're bringing in, risk as in the overall risk to the network and condition, but the actual selection is done at the MPO, RPO level. So hopefully they're pushing the other parameters at that level, because we just don't have the data to make those large scale decisions at my level.
And Jacob, your health index, is that a custom developed index for Connecticut DOT?
It is. So we have a health index inside of DTIMS that it looks at, the major structural components, looks at some of the elements, not too heavily weighted, and then additionally deck geometry, vertical clearance, and the load rating items to get an idea of, if this is at a low load posting, or it's got a low vertical clearance, or it's got poor deck geometry, maybe you should prioritize it for replacement instead of rehabilitation. It doesn't play a large role in our selection in the recommendation process. It's much more effective during our development of a project, but it will affect our overall program inside of these ones.
And I think for BRM states, I believe the utility function that helps choose appropriate treatments and then prioritize between potential bridge treatments is another avenue that folks have used. Sounds like similar approaches, different tools where you can weight these different aspects of performance other than condition. Yeah, thanks, Kent. So Kent just put in the chat some additional details to what I was trying to articulate there. So appreciate that. All right, we have a few minutes left. So I guess the last question for folks to consider is, do you feel you've successfully communicated your targets and maybe beyond targets, your overall performance expectations to various stakeholders? So potentially MPOs, your internal leadership, the public. Jacob, I think you spoke directly to that, how you're out communicating your proposed targets to the MPOs. So it sounds like you're tackling that. I know, Justin, do you have anything, further words of wisdom from PennDOT in regards to communication?
I think we do an okay job. I personally think we could do a better job, but that's outside of my area of expertise.
So I know that, and there are some folks, I believe, from Caltrans on the call. And Caltrans went through an extensive outreach process, both for asset management, investment strategy development, and targets. I believe that also affected or was considered in the target setting process in parallel with the TAMP. To work through the MPOs, to work with local owners and municipal county owners of NHS pavement and bridge assets, to make sure they understood their assets, the information about their assets, the options that were available to invest in condition and risk, and to gather information from those owners on how they anticipated, to understand how the state invests in bridge performance, but then also to get feedback from those owners on how they intended to invest, since so much of the NHS is local owned in California. And so that's another process. I think they just completed in developing their TAMP, but I will throw in a shout out to Caltrans and all those efforts. And I would expect to see some information on that published in the near future, not only through their TAMP, but other interested parties. So I think there's some pretty good examples of outreach there, but I'll open it up at this point if there's anybody who thinks they, would like an example, either if you'd like to brag a little bit about your agency, or if there's anybody else you'd like to hold up as an example that might help folks with that communications piece, either with it through target setting or once your targets have been set. All right. Well, it doesn't sound like anybody wants to volunteer.
I'll go ahead and chime in.
Thanks.
This is Kent again. Trying not to overtalk, but I can't seem to help myself.
I appreciate it.
We use a decision tree type of in-house software for the state system to make a preliminary recommendation based on inspection data that our bridge management group then reviews to come up with strategies and candidates to include in the program as part of our process. And we do this, it's very easy to just switch the bridges that are included in that. So any local owner that wants to see what the state would do with their bridges, if the state had those bridges, we make that available to them. So for our Mpos, we do run all of their bridges, not just their NHS bridges, through this system and send it over. It kind of only makes sense for bridges that are on paved roadways, because the repair treatments are specific to areas that have high chloride exposures. So it doesn't make as much sense for the smaller local owners where they're mostly gravel approach roads. And by the way, that is a blind spot in the NBI data that I don't think got fixed with the SMBI, is the approach roadway pavement. Sure would be nice if we had a data point on what that is, if it's gravel or paved, because it makes a difference in decisions about the bridges. But so anyway, we do communicate that. We make that available to our local agencies, and they can use it or not. It's not binding in any way, but we have seen that they have gone to prioritizing their higher traffic bridges over complicated assets, like over series of railroad and roadway interchanges. They've been prioritizing those bridges for aggressive preservation, as we would on the state system. So that's been encouraging.
Great, thanks. And I see Jeff has added to his comment that as we bring in these other elements, both through community, this kind of touches on our last 2 points. There's the element of making sure we understand safety, vulnerability, capacity, as well as condition needs, because there's opportunities to leverage different funds. Certainly there's, with the new bipartisan infrastructure law, it's a reintroduction of a world where we have a lot more fund sources and programs within the federal infrastructure bill than we had the last couple iterations. MAP 21 did a lot of consolidating. The number's grown since then. So there's a lot of constraints and requirements on where different program funding can and can't be used. So if we can identify candidates that are eligible for different types of funds, then you might be able to leverage those funding opportunities to tackle more than one performance area. So good point, Jeff. And I think you can do that through good communications with your MPO, municipal, local, county, and regional partners to make sure that you understand the needs of those areas and work together to identify not only the best projects that will help you achieve your performance goals, but also opportunities to fund those projects most efficiently. So good point. I think we're pretty much out of time. So I think I'll just take the last 2 minutes to thank everybody. Certainly, thank you, Jacob and Justin, for your participation today and your willingness to present. I think those are two fantastic examples of some well thought out and executed target setting processes. And I think there were a lot of takeaways from folks. And thank you all for the discussion and your questions. I think it's will definitely help us as we finalize the guide. And I'll just mention there is in the chat, if you scroll up a bit, there was a link posted where you can find the recordings to the previous 3 webinars in this series, and the recording of this webinar will also be posted on that site. It's in AASHTO. I think if you just go to the AASHTO TPM portal, you'll be able to find these by searching in the portal. Might be the easiest way to get there, but you can find the direct link in the chat. And again, if you happen to also be interested in pavement performance management, then 1 week from today in this same time slot, we will be having a webinar to discuss this same topic, but as it relates to setting pavement performance targets. So with that, I see we are at 4 o'clock. And I'll just ask Sarah, is there anything else that you would like to convey to folks before we adjourn?
No, thank you for all the participations. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I think this was a very effective workshop, and enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you next week.